All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is having a fantastic SciPy conference. I know that I am, and I'm very happy to be here to talk about Bokeh today. Actually, before I dive into the slides, the first thing I want to mention is a new release today, Bokeh 0.5 out. So before I even tell you what it is, I'm going to tell you that you need a new one. So check that out today, later on, after the talk, and feel free to come ask me questions as well. But that said, let's go ahead and dive into slides. So what is Bokeh? So Bokeh is a visualization system, a library for interactive big data and streaming data that targets the browser. We really wanted to make a platform that's available from Python, certainly. We're a big Python shop at Continuum, but also from other languages, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the main questions we wanted to answer are, where is ggplot for Python, right? So that's a question we want to answer. We want to be able to have interactive novel graphics, things like auto-faceting, statistical schematic charts for the 99% use case to get you going really quickly. We also wanted to be able to handle streaming and animated data, right? So we'll talk about how Bokeh affords the capability to have updating data, and if you push your updating data to the Bokeh server, then all of a sudden your plots and your charts update automatically. Also things like two-way communication back to a running Python process, so you can actually do more sophisticated analysis based on input and interactions from the user. Another thing that we wanted to handle is the big data case, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well with abstract rendering, a novel feature that, as far as I know, is fairly unique to Bokeh. A few other things to mention. We wanted to maintain some level of compatibility. I mean, Matplotlib is an amazing, fantastic library that has a long history and a long legacy, and we're all grateful for having Matplotlib around. So we want to make it easier for people to take their existing Matplotlib code, which all of us have, and to target Bokeh plots directly with that Matplotlib code, right? So you can take that code, put in maybe one extra line to Bokeh, and all of a sudden you've got an interactive Bokeh chart in the browser from your Matplotlib code. So that also affords things like Seaborn and ggplot.py compatibility as well. And of course, the biggest thing is you don't have to write any JavaScript. I mean, none of us want to write JavaScript. I know I don't. I have to write a lot of it. But none of us want to have to write JavaScript. And so you don't have to, which doesn't mean that you can't. If you actually really want to dive into Bokeh charts and plots, you can certainly use JavaScript to customize them very well. But you don't have to. And so I think that's a really important thing. So I mentioned the interactivity, and just to describe that a little bit more, the kinds of capabilities that we have. Obviously, the standard sort of panning and zooming tools, linking. So it's very easy to have linked brushing, linked selections on Bokeh plots, and we'll show some demos a little bit later. But also important to note that these selections can round trip to the server. I mentioned it's possible to have this full two-way communication, if you need it, back to some running Python process, so that you can have a selection that actually informs some computation that then feeds back into the plot. So this is, I think, a really powerful capability for enabling a lot of very unique and powerful visualizations. Things like a resize tool, you can actually drag, very easily resize the plot directly in the browser. No client-side intervention required there. Things like hover tools and click tools. We're in the process of adding more tools. There's a lot of things still yet to add. The to-do list is sort of a semi-unbounded, infinite list of things to do, but we're making our way through it, and there's still a lot of really good tools. And also now the widgets, right? So we just landed this in 0.5, and so you can have things like drop-downs and sliders and date selectors, and again, you can have this two-way communication back to a process that causes your chart to update. I'll show some examples here towards the end. I will mention there's a nice Bokeh gallery. These are all sort of static plots. We haven't gotten around quite yet to updating with some more of the server-based plots, but you can go to the gallery on bokeh.pydata.org and you can see a bunch of live plots that you can interact with, and you can see the code that was used to generate those. And typically the code is very, very short, which is also very nice as well. So there's definitely some interest in this kind of thing. So we have a quite active user community already. You can see there's lots of Stack Overflow questions, and we get an active mailing list and quite a few downloads per month. I think we're pushing about 7,000 just in the last month. So there's a lot of interest in this concept in general, and not just in Bokeh. I mean, there's a lot of other projects that are doing excellent work in this space as well. I mean, there's Jake Vanderplas's MPL-D3, and we use his MPL exporter actually to drive our Matplotlib compatibility, so we're very grateful for that. I think NVD3 is another one, and of course Plotly. So there's just general interest in this idea of being able to target the browser from other languages and to make interactive and novel plots. And so, we're putting our best effort forward, but there's plenty of people working on this problem. So there's lots of different alternatives. So just to talk a bit some about the novel kinds of graphics you can do with Bokeh. Here's an example just of some of the charts that are really easy to create with Bokeh. Obviously the one up here on the top left is a nice Seaborn chart. Again, because of the MPL compatibility, we have pretty much Seaborn compatibility for free. So we can generate those nice charts. We have things like this Burton chart. So this is a reproduction of a chart by a guy named Burton. He was, this is the upper right chart, trying to talk about the efficacy of different antibiotics versus different strains of bacteria. And it's sort of an interesting chart. I've never seen this done before, an inverted radial axis, actually. So obviously, the better an antibiotic is, the smaller the minimum inhibitory dose is. And so it actually inverts that radial axis, so the longer spikes correspond to the better antibiotics. Kind of weird. I'm not sure I would design that chart, but I just wanted to show off sort of the capability for designing really interesting and novel graphics with Bokeh. Things like maps, we're still working on some GIS projections, but you can definitely do some level of maps as well. And there's also a Google Maps plot that you can underlay a Google map underneath. We're going to try to add some open OSM, OpenStreetMap support as well. And then novel charts like this periodic chart, right? So that's actually a chart that's in the gallery you can go look at. It's actually basically a scatter plot, categorical scatter plot. And we scatter plot a lot of information on that, and it has this nice hover tool that lives on top of it that you can sort of drill down into columns that aren't necessarily shown on the actual plot. And so this was a fairly easy to create as well. So again, you can check that out in the gallery. Also, you can see the Les Mis co-occurrences as sort of a reproduction of a Mike Bostock plot he did with D3. It's a really nice chart that shows which characters were present in which chapters of together in which chapters of Les Mis. So that's kind of nice as well. I also mentioned sort of streaming and dynamic data, and so there definitely is a really big use case for us. I mean, this was a big priority for us to get to this point where we could add these sorts of features to Bokeh. On the left, you see streaming spectrogram, and I'll show that off here in a minute. Actually, I'll show it off now, right? So let's go ahead and go over to Safari. So, you know, this is a pretty simple app. This is actually a Bokeh.js app, although I'm in the process of porting it to pure Python. So there's a little Flask app on my server that's reading the microphone. Sort of live audio, it's doing an FFT, and then it's pushing this to this little web app that uses Bokeh.js, right? So, you know, we can do things like change the frequency range. We can see the power spectrum and the and the frequency spectrum, and there's a little goofy radial sort of graphic equalizer down there just for fun, just to sort of show things off. So that's always nice to do, and sort of see that little waterfall plot. All right. The one on the right is just an example of using the server to update data. So the way that Bokeh is architected, and I'll talk about it in a bit more in a minute, is that if you push updates to the data on the server, the plot automatically reacts. And so this is a novel little plot you can see in our examples in the GitHub repo that if you just start it, it starts rotating this nice little pattern around, and you can run that in the notebook. Big data is another really important sort of pillar of things that we want to support. We're trying at Continuum to build a platform for agile, platform of tools for agile data science, right? And so we're really betting on a heterogeneous future where there are going to be a lot of tools needed for to bring domain experts together with their data and being able to munge it in appropriate ways and get to it and derive insights from it. So some of those data sets are really big, and so we want to be able to handle those. And so obviously, if you have 100 million data points and 1 million pixels, well, you can plot it. Probably won't do you much good. You'll have just a solid rectangle on your screen. And so that's not so good. And so people try things to be a little bit more sophisticated. And I'll talk about some of the things that we've done with our academic collaborator to handle this big data case where you can get tens, hundreds of millions of points in your plots in a meaningful way. And also to investigate large data cubes. Works with the IPython notebook really well. You can do all of these in the notebook. You can have server plots in the notebook that are getting data, updates from the server that update in your notebook, or you can have standalone plots in the notebook as well. All of them have the standard tools, selection, pannings, resizing, and zooming. All of those things exist, and that's really nice. And again, just to reiterate, no JavaScript, right? So this is some examples of some of the code that's really required to generate these plots. So here on the left, we have this little choropleth. I think it's unemployment in Texas in 2009. And so there's just basically a little line of code. So the idea here is that we have this notion of glyphs, and you can sort of vectorize or splat these glyphs, across some data set. You can attach the different properties of these glyphs to columns of data. And the same is true with the patches glyph. So the patches glyph takes a vector of patches data, and it just basically gives you a scatter plot of patches, and all of a sudden you have a map of Texas. And you can attach hover tools to this and all kinds of things like that. Again, we have a histogram over here, and you can see there's a few lines of code to get this histogram together with the cumulative and the probability distribution functions. This is actually getting easier. One of the things that also landed in Bokeh 0.5 is a very, very high-level Bokeh.charts interface. So we have a very layered API for Bokeh. We have a very sort of low-level object interface that mirrors the JavaScript side very closely, and you can do really novel and interesting things with that. We have sort of a middle matplotlib, MATLAB type plotting API that's sort of this type of style of API. And Bokeh.charts really aims to go even higher if you're really doing sort of statistical plotting and we want to handle those common cases with just a line of code. You pass in your pandas data frame and boom, you're ready to go. So this is even easier now than it was when I made these slides. Another example, here's a nice plot. This is actually a contributor added this to our gallery. We've made it a little bit easier to set some of these parameters. For instance, the axis label is a little bit easier now. But you can still see it's just a couple of calls, pass in your data, set some visual aspects of your plot, and you're ready to go with all the tools. So talk a little bit about the architecture of Bokeh. So sort of previous models for this, the way people handle this, you can think of things like Flot and D3 and high charts, is that you generate one script for your visualization. You sort of one shot and you're done. So here, you've got some map model, you've got some server maybe, but the server takes this template and fills in some bits, and then you're done. This is your plot. It's static. It's got the data. It's right there. It's, it is what it is. It's great, but you can't really sort of push data to it. So Bokeh.js is a little bit different model. We really wanted to decouple the aspects of the front end and necessarily the back end. So there's actually two parts of Bokeh. There's Bokeh, the Python library, and then there's Bokeh.js, which is really a standalone JavaScript library that is, I would describe it as a reactive scene graph compiler. What it accepts as input are declarative descriptions of the scene, of the plot that you would like to render. What axes should I have? What data column should connect to what glyphs? What tools do I want? It takes references to the data, and then it renders the scene. And so the nice thing about this is that any language that can generate this JSON can target Bokeh, and so we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Obviously, we're a big Python shop, so we really invested heavily in the Python bindings for Bokeh, but you can certainly have other ones as well. But the nice thing about this decoupled architecture is that, again, now you have this place, this Bokeh server, which if you use the Bokeh server, you can optionally push and pull data to and from, either interactions back from the user or updated data up to the plot. So it's really flexible architecture that affords a lot of interesting and novel capability. Just if you're curious about the sort of things we use to build this in, Bokeh.js is actually written in CoffeeScript. We used HTML5 canvas. It's not based on D3 or SVG or anything like that. We wanted to be able to have a little bit more performance in sort of the mid-data case. If you do want to render 20,000 points, D3 is not going to like that very much because now you have 20,000 DOM elements, but Bokeh should be able to handle that without much issue. We also use Backbone.js, AMD modules. It plays well in JS Fiddle. You can go to a Bokeh.js Fiddle page and sort of put these plots in fiddles and play around with them pretty easily. Again, we wrote the JavaScript. You don't have to. So this is the architecture really of Bokeh. So we have a server. And then we have some code that generates an object graph, right? A bunch of little objects in Python that represent, again, the axes, the plot you want, the attributes on the plot, all the different properties that you might like to have, as well as the data. And it pushes that up to the server or pushes references to the data up to the server. And then the server generates some JSON that goes to the browser and then reconstructs this object graph in JavaScript and then renders the plot based on that. And so that's, so far, nothing too terribly new. What's really exciting is this other two-way communication that's possible, right? Again, we can go back and forth between the client to the Bokeh server. We can report selections that the user makes or widgets that they click on or that they select back to the server. That can go back to a running Python process to do more computation. And then we can push updates to the plot as well. Again, anytime the data up on the server updates, the plot automatically resizes and readjusts and replots itself. So you don't have to worry about that. So again, it's a very reactive type model. So just to give you some kind of example of what that looks like in practice, so here's a very simple iris.py. So we use the sort of famous statistical flowers data set. We want to plot, little circles for the different types of flower, the types of flowers, versicolor, virginica, and setosa. And we want to plot the petal length versus the petal width. So this is sort of common in statistical examples. So you can see not too much Python code here, although again, this is also much simpler. The Bokeh.charts interface, that's actually one line of code with Bokeh.charts. And so this is what the generated output would look like. And so you don't have to care about that, which is nice. But just to give you some idea what that's like is, there's a lot of bits and pieces in here in this all data sort of variable. And that actually contains the data and the objects of your plot that you want to be rendered. Sort of the overarching skeleton would look like this when you embed it in a document. There's something that is going to go ahead and load your models. It's going to go ahead and reconstitute those models and create a default view for it, and that actually causes your plot to be rendered. But all the information is in that. You see var all models equals JSON data. That's that big blob of data on the previous slide. And so this is what we do when we say, we talk about bindings for Bokeh. We really mean a language that can generate the appropriate JSON to fill in that all models block of data. And any language that can do that can target Bokeh. And so we'll talk about some other folks that are working on that as well. Here's maybe a little bit of a zoom in on the detail of what some of that data looks like. So here, for instance, we have the notion of a data source, a column data source. It has maybe an X column in it. It has some IDs. We have a data range 1D object that describes sort of what's the range of this particular dimension or axis on the plot should be. So it's just little bits of JSON with unique IDs that get reconstituted into backbone models. And again, the nice thing about that is it's a very clean separation, a very clean decoupling of the client browser side and other people that want to use that, other languages. In particular, one of our devs is a big Scala guy, so he's created Scala bindings for Bokeh. We had some Julia guys come by our GitHub not too long ago and say, hey, we really want to have native Julia bindings for Bokeh. I mean, it's possible to actually just, I guess, import Python modules directly somehow into Julia, and so you can actually plot from that today with Julia, but they want some native bindings in Julia, and so he's working on native. I think 0.1 was released just a few days ago, Samuel Colvin. So you can check those out on GitHub. Obviously, I'd love to have bindings in as many languages as possible. I think I'm going to try to dig into an R language binding here pretty soon. But anyone who's interested in targeting these interactive graphics for big data from the browser, if you're using Python, if you're using other languages, by all means, let's get into it. Okay, so what kind of things maybe are coming next for Bokeh? So actually, first, maybe I should sort of step back and talk about what landed today in Bokeh 0.5. So some of the main things that landed today are, again, the widgets that, again, allow you to have drop-downs and other interactive type tools around to sort of build like an app or a dashboard that can communicate back to a Python process, can have updates show up on your plot. We also landed the Bokeh.charts interface, which again is a very, very high level, schematic statistical plotting interface. Lets you do very powerful things in just a little bit of code. We also made our embedding API much simpler, much cleaner, much more well documented. So if you want to take a Bokeh plot and embed it in some HTML document, either as a standalone transportable document or as a document that refers to the server or the data maybe on the server, there's a variety of ways and combinations to do that. And the API for doing that now is very, very clean and very well demonstrated. There's some examples that show just how to do all these different cases. And we also have the first sort of integration of abstract rendering. And so I don't actually have a slide in here to talk about that. So let me briefly mention what abstract rendering is. We have an academic collaborator on Bokeh. Joseph Cottam, he's the original author of Protoviz and the stencil grammar, and he's an academic up at the University of Indiana, and he's got some really interesting ideas about how you might deal with the case where you have 100 million points. So I should mention, built into Bokeh already, we have the capability to do things like downsampling on the server. So we can actually just do sort of naive, simple downsampling on a big data cube and be able to interactively zoom through it, and I'll show that in a second. But he's got some really fantastic ideas that really go even beyond downsampling. And basically the idea is to sort of abstractly render this huge data set onto a canvas, but collect statistical information about where the data actually would hit different pixels. And then you can do really smart things like not have a single alpha value for compositing, but do alpha shading across your data set. So I like to think of it as high dynamic range for data. So if you're familiar with HDR photography, the idea of sort of expanding the dynamic range of your data, that's really the idea behind abstract rendering, and that's what sort of just now landed in Bokeh 0.5, some of the first parts of that. So that's really what we wanted to get to. So ultimately, these are sort of our goals. It's just it took us a while. We had to build a plotting system that could plot first, and so then now we get to the point where we can actually add these really good features for interactivity and for building dashboards and for having things like abstract rendering. So that's sort of landed now. What else is coming in the future, in the near future? More ideas, sort of a Bokeh app notion, being able to really easily create applications with widgets and plots that interact much more simply, sort of streamline that process. And I'd love to get feedback from folks about where any rough spots are or places that could be made easier. Also advanced data-driven layout, and this actually almost landed in Bokeh 0.5, or at least the start of it. But we're adding the Kiwi.js constraint solver written by Chris Colbert from Enamel. And so we're adding that to Bokeh.js to handle the layout on the canvas. So we can do really interesting things with sort of data-driven layout. You could imagine having subplots on the axes that have histograms, and then if you do a selection, the plots update based on exactly where the selection is on the plot. So that sort of thing is very important. SVG output, looking to add that as well. Command line tool, this would be really cool, I think. We'd actually love to have a Bokeh command line tool where you can just sort of point it at some CSV file and all of a sudden you get a plot up in your browser. So we'd really love to make a nice little command line tool that can ingest and even start putting stuff into the server from the command line tool as well. And again, as I mentioned, improved GIS support as well. So lots of stuff coming on the pipeline. Again, as I mentioned, it's sort of a semi-infinite list of to-do things. Here's some examples of some of the data apps. These are in 0.5 now. Here we have a little app that lets you sort of select some financial data, and you can select different stocks to get correlations around them, and then select the histogram for just the selected part. This little download dashboard, it shows maybe sort of daily, monthly downloads, lets you select which product you want to see, and gives you a little punch card about when the most activity was happening. Dashboard Crossfilter tool. This went in as well. It's a little bit rough. We're going to have to clean this this one up a little bit, but the idea behind this is that you can select different columns of your data that you want to filter by and maybe also facet them as well. So I'll show that off here in just a second. Yeah, I think I have time. Last thing I'll mention, Bokeh, Bokeh.js, the server, all of it is open source. It's on GitHub BSD license. We'd love to have feedback, and we'd love to have more contributions. Obviously, that's the sort of the lifeblood of a really active open source project, is getting more people invested and involved. Right now there's maybe 3 sort of really active people on Bokeh, and then a few other people that do more part-time work. So we'd love to get more people involved in using Bokeh and extending it and adding new features to it and fixing bugs and documentation, whatever. So I'll just sort of close before some examples by saying that I'll be here. Would love to talk to anybody. I'll be at the Continuum table upstairs. I will be at both the visualization box. I think there's one today and there's definitely one tomorrow. We'll be at the happy hour, Thursday, the Continuum happy hour, so come by and chat. And I'll also be here Friday for Sprint. So anyone who's interested in coming to Sprint on Bokeh, I would love to sort of talk and either help you, use Bokeh for your own problems, and maybe we'll get something that can go in the gallery out of that, or if you're really interested in core dev, we can talk about that as well. So would love to see people. So let me just do a couple of minutes, show a few things off, and then take some questions. So again, here's the spectrogram. That's great. Here's this plot server. So this is actually a 4 gig data cube that's living on a DigitalOcean box. And so what's really interesting about this, it does this sort of progressive refinement as I zoom through this 4 gig data cube, is that we've done, at this point, sort of the stupidest, most naive things possible. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit to sort of improve the experience of this. We don't really have a tile interface yet. It sort of takes a little bit of time to load. But that's still pretty good for doing the sort of the dumbest thing possible. So like I said, this is a 4 gig data cube. I think this would scale very easily, to sort of tens or hundreds of gigs, because the downsampling is actually not what takes time. Right now, we just sort of transport the data really stupidly, and we could do a much better job of that. So this is an example of sort of what the server affords, right? The downsampling is actually done on the Bokeh server. Here's another example using line charts. I forget how many points are in this chart. I asked and I forgot to get the number, but you can sort of see as you zoom in, you get progressive refinement of the detail, not trying to do anything. This is that Crossfilter application. Again, this one's a little bit rough if you try it out today, but the idea is, here I've got this scatter plot of this auto data MPG. I want to go ahead and maybe filter by, different. Let me reload this page, actually. There we go. I want to go ahead and filter by, which ones have different miles per gallon. I want to really, care about these, and so my plot maybe updates, and maybe I actually want to factor by the number of cylinders so I can get a nice auto-faceting on the number of cylinders. So this is coming in. We're going to be making quite a few improvements in the next few weeks to this one as well. Here's an example just of using widgets. It's a little Taylor function approximator, so you can slide, and set what order of Taylor approximation you want, and you get feedback with the plot. So that's good. Another one example of widgets, just a little population, population explorer, population density, downloads amp, and I think that's about it. So I think if I want to take any questions at all, we'll have to sort of stop now. So yeah, so any questions? Oh, thanks.